So I know a lot of people are going to be mad at me for making this video, but people are going to say what they're going to say. Let's just go with the video anyway. We're going to have a lot of people typing in the comments, Sony is the best, Nikon's the best, Pentax's the best, Kodak's the best, Canon's the best. But I'm not necessarily trying to get into that argument right now. I just want to tell you guys why I think the R5 is the best camera ever made. And you have to understand the whole historical context before you actually say, oh, this is just a regular camera that overheats at the sign of any kind of video. Yeah, you can say that. But at the end of the day, you have to understand the entire context and why this is the best Canon camera ever made. And then you have to understand why this is the best camera ever made. Alright, so let's understand it from the context of history. Now, let's think about 5D Mark I and the 5D Mark II. Now, for those of you who haven't thought about these cameras and Canon's history tell you a lot about what they're about to do next and how much they're giving you based off of the predecessor of that camera. So based off of the predecessor of the 5D Mark II, the 5D Mark I was a big leap from the 5D Mark II. Now you might be saying to yourself, back then, the 5D Mark I was the first cheap full-frame camera that people can buy, and it was less than half of the price of the flagship on average. So you might be saying, yes, Devin, I understand what you're saying. The 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II is a big leap, but you have to understand the 5D Mark I was the first of its class, half the price of a full-frame sensor or a flagship model, which was the 1DS at the time. The 1DS was the flagship with the full-frame sensor, and the 1D was the APS-H sensor, a slightly smaller sensor than full frame. So you had to understand exactly what we were dealing with at the time. But going from the 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II, these two cameras were essentially the same price for the time, around $3,000 to $4,000, right in that price range. Same thing with the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark IV. But when you're going from the 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II, this is a huge leap. You go from a camera with 12 megapixels full frame and some minor, photographic abilities to a 5D Mark II, a camera with a 1080p video output, full frame, and then 21 megapixels. There weren't a lot of 21 megapixel cameras on the market at the time from Nikon or Canon, period, let alone them being full frame and being under $6,000 at the time. You have to adjust for inflation too, but you have to understand that's a huge leap from the 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II. Now you notice I didn't put the 5D Mark III to the 5D Mark IV because that was a minuscule update, especially when you had the motion JPEG on the 4K with the 5D Mark IV. Yes, the sensor had better dynamic range, but Canon's always been behind in dynamic range. And for the most part, the autofocus system didn't really change all that much from the 5D Mark III to the 5D Mark IV. So let's go back to the 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II. This is a huge leap. And then Canon, their defense, when they said when the 5D Mark II was legendary for its 1080p video and all this stuff, they were just saying, oh, we just put that in there just because we wanted to see what everybody would think and stuff like that. And they really gave we didn't really think that this was going to be big as it is. So when they found that out, then they started making cinema cameras because they understood that this hybrid new camera was the future, much like mirrorless is kind of the future right now. I say kind of because DSLR mirrorless cameras are not that different. Mirrorless cameras still have a little while to go before they actually really beat out DSLRs. Unlike film versus digital, where it was like a real abrupt change into the digital world. But you have to understand that going from that 5D1 to 5D2 was a big thing. Going to the 5D1 to the 5D2 was just like the Eos-r to the R5. Because the Eos-r wasn't hitting on anything. Nobody really was looking in the Eos-r's direction. The only reason why the Eos-r was relatively popular is because it was Canon's first swing at a full-frame mirrorless camera, and it didn't really even do a good job at that. But the people who had lenses knew that that adapter would help them enter this new mirrorless world, and the lenses were fire, and they still are to this day. Those RF lenses are still super fire because Canon knows lens design, and Canon is smart. As a matter of fact, Canon makes pretty much everything that camera comes with. Canon pretty much makes. They make their own sensors, they make their own processors, all of this stuff, whereas Nikon doesn't really do that, and a lot of other camera companies don't make their own stuff. So Canon has their fingers in everything that their cameras can do, how powerful they are, what they can do, how the technology is advancing, and everything else. They're not beholden to another company by making sensors like Nikon antagonists to Sony, especially on their smaller end cameras, like their I think the 3200, all these crop frame sensor cameras, they're pretty much Sony sensors. Now the bigger end sensors, Nikon pretty much makes themselves, but you got to understand they're not beholden to another company to provide technology. So their advancement in that technology is direct cause from their studying and producing better technology with engineering of their own strength, of their own abilities. So when you take that into context, you might be saying, well, why is going from the 5D Mark I to the 5D Mark II such a big feat in price? And then such a big feat for Canons, because they were able to give you essentially a totally different camera for the same price. So now that you know that, they did the same exact thing with the Eos-R to Eos-R5. They gave you a tremendously different camera for essentially what amounts to the same price. I'm just saying, wow, going from 4K cropped to 8K uncropped is definitely a tremendous feat for Canon. But they can always do these things. They can always pull the ace out of their sleeve when they need to. But in this case with the R5, they had to cripple it, like Casey from Camera Conspiracies always says. You got to look at Camera Conspiracies. Look him up. He's just so funny. If you're a nerd, you love talking about cameras. Casey is just funny with his antics. But back to what I was saying, you have to understand that Canon has to cripple their cameras in another way. They had to find another way, because crippling it at the 1080p and the 4K and the 24p, all this other stuff, wasn't cutting it anymore. And a lot of people don't buy cameras for megapixels. A lot of people don't buy Canons for the photography aspect as much anymore, because most cameras just do the exact same thing, unless you put some tremendous different type of technology in it, like image stabilization via the sensor, or eye tracking autofocus for birds and wildlife and all this other stuff. So Canon wanted to really give us what we were asking for, but they didn't know how to tame the beast, so to speak, so they made it overheat. Now, if you watch my last video, you'll understand that that overheating thing is actually pretty fake. It's just software crippling. It's just software telling the camera to overheat, because a lot of people have really hacked it and shown us that, hey, this thing can actually film for some reasonable times that we're all used to. Canon's just telling you it's overheating based off of some things that we bypassed in the system. So now you might be understanding why Canon's new camera is such an amazing Canon camera on its own merit, because Canon gave us some stuff that they haven't given us in the last 12 years since the 5D Mark II came out. That's why people were comparing it to the legendary 5D Mark II, because this new leap in technology, this boost in technology, is something that Canon is known for doing, unlike other companies. They can't boost their technology as good as Canon can. Now you might be saying Sony did it with the first Alpha camera. Yeah, they kind of did with the Alpha mirrorless camera, but you have to understand that Sony's been around for a while, and they've pretty much been their own kind of underdog sleeper, if you will, because they've been creating this technology nobody's been buying, so nobody's really been talking about them. But they're such a big electronics company, they can stay around. And now that they've gotten these full frame Alpha cameras out, they've now garnered all that attention now. But Sony's been around for a long time, so they've had time to build up on all the idealistic things that they've been doing, and they make Nikon sensors. So you have to understand that they've been around, they just haven't garnered as much attention. And so this new update to full frame mirrorless cameras is not so much a surprise to me. But imagine if this camera never overheated and it gave us everything that's given us now. You'd be like, wow, Sony a7S III really has a competitor. Well, what if they came out with a firmware update 2.0 and it barely overheated, maybe a year down the line now? Now it's coming down in price. Now it's uncrippled and there's no overheating. You can't tell me that that's not one of the best cameras ever made. Now, no, I do not have the camera in my hand. It's actually kind of hard getting the camera now because so many people are purchasing it, and coronavirus and shipping and all this other stuff. But you got to understand that this camera, in my opinion, is the best camera ever made, because not only can you update it via firmware, but it's giving you so many things on the photography side that people don't even think about. Like the FTP transfer protocol that you can now offload all your files onto like a cloud server. And now it's had its issues with the hacking recently with Canon, but introducing this technology means that Canon's working on it. Introducing 4K, 8K, 45 megapixel sensors means that Canon's working with higher levels of this stuff. As a matter of fact, there's some rumors coming down the mill that says that Canon's coming up with Canon R5S, which is a higher megapixel sensor, 90 megapixels. You remember saying, dang, that must really overheat. I don't even think that thing is going to overheat. They're going to make it, they're going to put it out saying it overheats, but it's more like we're going to limit the camera with our own artificial software. But what do you think in the comments below? Tell me what you think. Do you think the R5 is the best camera ever made? Do you think it's the best Canon camera ever made? Because yeah, you got the cinema cameras, but they pale in comparison when it comes to actually doing photographs. So as a hybrid camera, a camera that can pretty much do it all, I think it's the best camera ever made because of the potential and because Canon didn't charge as much as they should have charged for it. What do you think? I'm Devin with CFX Studios, and stay tuned for the next video.